Society for Multidisciplinary and Fundamental Research, SEMF from its original Spanish acronym, is created in response to the current scientific, social, and technological environment. Despite the fast communications and interconnectivity of the information age, most branches of knowledge are still largely segregated, and institutions dedicated to their advancement tend to be managerially complex, often constrained by their history and rarely in substantial cooperation with each other. This contrasts with recent developments, showing that today's frontiers of human understanding often lie outside the bounds of traditional disciplines. SEMF aims to address fundamental questions with rigour and honesty, always striving to consider them broadly, profoundly, and contextually. We believe that this type of intellectual endeavour is most likely to flourish in dynamic environments that foster the creative exploration of ideas and the organic growth of research projects and collaborations. SEMF aspires to provide such an environment by keeping things simple, staying managerially lightweight, and being run by a team of active researchers and intellectuals. At SEMF, we promote rationality and scientific thinking across all human inquiry, since we consider these to be the best tools for development of civilization and the understanding of the universe we all inhabit. Our universalist approach to human knowledge helps us bridge the gap between traditionally disjointed disciplines, particularly the familiar yet limiting divide between the sciences and humanities. This mindset allows us to identify deep themes across diverse topics, a powerful asset when trying to unify separate areas of research. Ultimately, SEMF aims to establish a pluralistic community of scientists, creatives, academics, artists, students, intellectuals, and generally enthusiasts united under the common goal of delving deeper into fundamental questions. In principle, all topics are welcome under the SEMF dome. However, given its fundamental nature, subjects such as linguistics, physics, cognitive science, mathematics, complexity science, philosophy, biology, or computer science are well represented in our events and activities. To accomplish our goals, we currently do three things. We ideate and organise transdisciplinary conferences and seminars. We host the SEMFoloquia podcast, where small groups of experts with different backgrounds come together to discuss a transversal topic. And we maintain the Agora, a platform implemented on Discord and Telegram, where our members can self-organise and participate in talks, debates, study groups and social gatherings. All the information about SEMF can be found on our website, www.semf.org.es. There you can also become a member in a couple of clicks. In our YouTube channel, you can find our live streams and podcast recordings. And follow us on Twitter to stay up to date with all our events and announcements, and find us on most other social media platforms.
Welcome everybody from whenever and wherever you're watching this live stream. I'm very excited to invite you to the first event of the Edinburgh branch of the International Society for Multidisciplinary and Fundamental Research, of which Carlos, who's joining us today, is the president. We also have representatives from 6 different disciplines in the University of Edinburgh, the majority of which are from different societies. And yeah, thank you all for joining us. We're excited to have this interdisciplinary collaboration on one of the very fundamental questions in science, maths, but also now in humanities and arts. What is number? Where are numbers? Now I'm going to have the societies introduce themselves, the different disciplines, and how about we start off with Fanula and Sharissa from mathematics.
So hello, I'm Fanula. I'm just going into my 3rd year studying maths at the University of Edinburgh. So here representing the Maths Society. I'm really excited for this discussion because I think it's great to get so many people from different disciplines within the university talking about one topic and having all that different knowledge from different topics coming in to share one common goal. So yes, very excited. I'll pass on to Sharissa now.
So hi everyone, my name is Sharissa Naidu, not Golab Global. I'm also going on to 3rd year with Fanola, but I study maths and philosophy. So I think I'm just really excited for this event because I get to philosophize about maths. But yeah, very excited to be here.
Lovely, thank you. And from cognitive science, we have Alba and Roxana, if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Hello everyone, my name is Albatul, or just Alba. I'm studying psychology and I'm going into 3rd year, and I'm here representing the Cognitive Science Society as the new president. I'm really excited for this event because cognitive science in itself is an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary subject, and it's exciting to expand that even more to like biology and physics. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Roxana. I'm also going into my 3rd year studying artificial intelligence, and I'm representing the cognitive science field or society with Alba. And I come from an informatics background, but also having dabbled in philosophy and very, very interested in cognitive science. I love the interdisciplinary tackling of questions that really do concern so many disciplines.
That's lovely. Some really great insight into why this is such a useful and revealing event. Kartikeya from physics, we'd love to hear from you.
Hi, I'm Kartikeya Dhingra, also going into 3rd year, and I'm representing physics today. The main motivation for coming here was to talk, to listen, and possibly just learn more about numbers and maybe help you in the process as well.
That's great. And from biology, we have Diana.
Hi everyone, I'm going into 3rd year as well of biochemistry, and I'm representing Biosoc. And I think this is a great initiative because in such a fast-paced world with things changing all the time, I think interdisciplinarity is so important, and the more we know about everything, the better. Yeah.
Perfect, lovely. That's great. Luca from philosophy.
Hi everyone, I'm Luca from philosophy. I'm really excited for this event because my interests cross over from philosophy into maths and then logic and the kind of synthesis between those things. And coming from my background, I think interdisciplinarity is basically essential. In philosophy, we really try and analyze approaches to conceptual frameworks, and the best way to do that is to just kind of put them against one another in terms of different disciplines and different fields. And I'm really looking forward to this.
That's great. And last but not least, from computer science and engineering, Daniel.
Hi, I'm Daniel, and I do electronics and computer science engineering, and I'll be doing engineering and computer science representing. And so I'm really interested in thinking about how we can combine different fields, modeling biology and computers, for instance, using our physical framework to build all sorts of cool things in real life. And I'm really excited for this event to discuss with everyone here about all sorts of knowledge and number theories. So yeah.
That's really great. Thank you everyone for being here in the first place. I really appreciate you all coming, and I hope everyone will enjoy the discussion that is to follow. Okay, Carlos, would you like to tell us a bit more about the Society for Multidisciplinary and Fundamental Research? That would be great.
Yes, of course, my pleasure. So welcome everybody. I'm delighted to see this amount of younger people gathered around the idea of interdisciplinarity. I mean, not so long ago, I was just in your position. I've recently finished my PhD at the University of Edinburgh, and I've been teaching as a university teacher in the School of Mathematics. I'm sure some of you actually remember me from some of the lectures. And yes, it's my pleasure to be here introducing what I hope will become the Edinburgh chapter for SEMF. I mean, SEMF is just starting up, so we're just sort of assembling ourselves as an international society. And of course, I am based in Edinburgh at the moment, and I've been in Edinburgh for a long time. So I'll be very interested to follow up with many of you, I hope, to actually institute the chapter in the university so you can keep going after this initial events. So anyway, so what is SEMF? So SEMF, as the name indicates, is something about multidisciplinarity and something about fundamental. I would describe SEMF to someone who doesn't know what SEMF is as a place where you can be intellectually free and when there is no cost to being crazy and being, thinking in entirely divergent ways. So we all know that, as a student, you have the risk of, passing exams or not learning the right material for your tests, or, later in life, you might want to apply for positions, and, you whether you get jobs or not depends on whether you're sort of aligning with the criteria and the assessment of your field. And this is necessary at times, and I mean, it can be debated whether it's so must be so prominent, but it's certainly necessary at some points. But then if we do this too much, we just lose track of what's the point, right? And the point, in my opinion, is to understand and to share our knowledge about things in general, right? And so if someone wants to understand, disciplines, assessment, systems, institutions, all these things are very secondary. Understanding is first, and everything comes later. So SEMF, in some sense, is born out of this desire to understand at a very fundamental level, hence the word fundamental. And multidisciplinary, well, that's just an accident of our present history. So I know that we're making a big fuss about interdisciplinarity and combining disciplines and so on, and it's really exciting. But I don't want to give off the wrong impression that this is sort of a goal in itself. Interdisciplinarity, I don't think, should ever be a goal in itself. Interdisciplinarity is just a means to get into the interesting stuff. And we live in a world where different sciences have evolved for maybe thousands of years, others just for a few decades, but still with exponential growth. And all this has resulted in a landscape of departments, schools, colleges of science and engineering, and colleges of arts, and all these kind of things, right? So institutions that have sprung out of this development. And SEMF is here basically to say, well, all this architecture is necessary, all this power behind science is necessary, but we also need havens where we can just retreat and think and discuss and sort of be free to be free of assessment, be free of performance worries, and so on. So SEMF is first and foremost that. It's meant to be sort of a community, virtual space, especially now when there's still pandemic going around, but certainly physical, hopefully at some point as well, where you can come and you can discuss ideas. And again, the boundary of what SEMFs consider ideas is the boundary of the human mind. It's not the boundary of disciplines. It's not the boundary of what history has given us. It's not the boundary of funding. It's not the boundary of prestige or status within the academic world. And so we're very humbled that last week we had our launch event. We had our first international scientific conference, and we managed to gather basically one of the brightest set of people in the world that you can imagine to talk about numbers specifically, and they were very excited about this idea. So I can say this what I've been doing for the last couple of years with SEMF. I can say it's now very very well regarded and very well sort of perceived in the international and the sort of higher spheres of science. But anyway, so let me show you very briefly, also for our viewers, what this looks like. So I'm gonna move over to another tab, so people in the Zoom call won't be able to see it, but you can roam around this semf.org.es. I'm sure that you've had a look at our website. So let me just show you our website. So for our viewers, this is where you can visit our site. We have all kinds of information about ourselves, what we're trying to do, what kind of activities we have lined up, what kind of projects are ongoing, if you want to get involved, how you can do that. So just as a pointer, I'll remind of this again at the end of the session today. But if you want to be in touch, if you think SEMF is something that appeals to you in any way, in any capacity, I imagine most of you are students, are university students at the moment. You can just go to this tab on the website, participate, and you will see a button that says Join SEMF. So you can just click on that, and you will see this form to be filled. Basically, it just requires you to put in your data, your name and your email address, and to select some disciplines that you're interested in, just for purely statistical reasons. And this will give you access to our private servers and to our mailing list, and that's the way you become part of SEMF. At the moment, this is all we have, and it's very lightweight. It's completely free. You don't have to really worry about anything. We'll basically just store your contact info and send you some notifications when events are happening or when we're doing calls. And so this is a very good opportunity to join the rest of the community, because we have our servers and our chat rooms where other members are sort of roaming, and so slowly this will grow. So this is SEMF in general. I'll be happy to, if in the end we have some time, maybe some people have some questions. I'm happy to discuss. If you want to know more, just contact me personally. If you are in the University of Edinburgh, I'm sure you can find me, and I'll be happy to discuss it in person. Now, so we have a topic at hand, right? We are talking about numbers. So we have this slogan, what are numbers? And I thought, maybe a year ago, something along those lines, I had this idea of, we use numbers all the time. I'm a mathematician, I'm a physicist, I've been trained in all these things. I have this absolutely second nature by now. But what are really numbers? It sounds almost like a stupid question, but actually, you can see in the literature, you can see in the history of science, there has been debate about the nature of numbers all along, and there's no resolution. We had a huge conference last week, and this is what you're seeing on your screens on the live stream, where we basically asked one of the most influential thinkers in many areas of mathematics, cognitive science, physics, and generally, biology, complexity science, etc., about this question, and they were all very interested to come and discuss and to bring in different points of view. So certainly signaling at the fact that this is not a result issue. So anyway, so the event has passed. You can find all the talks and all the discussion sessions in our YouTube channel. So if you're watching us now, it is on this YouTube channel. And here you can see the speakers that we had. So some of you might know Stephen Wolfram from Wolfram Alpha and Mathematica, and some of you might know David Krakauer. He is the director of Santa Fe Institute. Rafael Núñez wrote a book called Where Do Numbers Come From? Or I think, no, that was a paper. So the book was What Does Mathematics Comes From? Which is a very sort of fundamental question posed that way. He has this more cognitive and evolutionary approach to mathematics. We had Karen Lee Oberman, who is a cognitive archaeologist. So in case anyone was wondering why we ever needed to talk to an archaeologist when thinking about numbers, so she presented a very fascinating perspective of the sort of origins of numbers in terms of human cultures and traditions. And then we had Nicholas, he was a physicist, Andrea is a philosopher, Menachem is a mathematician, Kevin Butler is also a pure mathematician. We had inputs from cognitive science, from complexity science, from philosophy of cognitive science, from neuroscience. Grace Lindsay has a book called Models of the Mind, and that's why we invited her. So anyway, I just invite you to explore the website, watch the sessions. The videos of the talks will appear on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. We're going to post a lot of material that came from the discussions as well. So do look for that and subscribe to the channel if you want to be notified. So to get into the topic, and I'll just let you be, and I'll shut up for the rest of this mostly. I wanted to introduce the questions that we're thinking about. So what do we think when we say what are numbers? So you can take this into many different angles, and I'm sure Lucy will conduct or will direct the discussion in many interesting directions with different participants from different societies giving their perspective. I'll be here to give you some insights and perhaps help a little bit if you have some deeper questions. Basically by echoing what I learned last week and what I've been researching myself to put this event together. But there are essentially five branches of questioning. So you can think in terms of, well, I am some kind of material system, I'm doing something cognitive in this world, and it seems that numbers are super efficient at doing certain tasks, right? So if you want to organize your week ahead, knowing amounts of things, say amount of hours in a day, or knowing the number of times that you need to water your plants, or go and check for things. Numbers are super efficient at organizing that kind of thing. So when you are an active cognitive system doing things, numbers prop up as a natural sort of arrangement mechanism. Then there's the question of how does that cognitive system process the numbers themselves? I mean, we seem to be seeing numbers everywhere. We can count discrete things. You look at your hand and you see fingers, and we count with our fingers. This is very well documented. But then we think of our nervous system doing all the processing, and are there numbers in the brain? Do you have a neuron that is actually counting? I mean, there's some interesting evidence that this might be a possibility. It's by no means confirmed, but there are some studies that actually might trace numbers all the way down to the biological machinery of neurons. So meaning actually the biochemistry of cells might be directly related to numerosity processing and to number cognition in general, or quantal condition as Nunez would say. Anyway, so another perspective is to take the very naturalist and very materialist sort of position and just think of the world. I think so. Did we just come up with numbers because, as we said, they are efficient and they are apt to the tasks that we need to do, or are they really embedded in reality? Are they part of fundamental reality? And some fun questions that you can ask is that, if you've ever heard about the simulation argument, you might be thinking, well, if we are running on some kind of computer and that computer is running on a digital code, then numbers are naturally the foundation of reality. But obviously, this is just a hypothesis. There doesn't seem to be a way to actually directly test for this hypothesis. So it's just a fun mental experiment. But nonetheless, the question still remains: are numbers fundamentally embedded in nature, or are we just projecting our cognitive expectations and our cognitive models into the world? So that's the question. And then of course we have the mathematical angle. So we haven't mentioned mathematics. I mean, everyone associates numbers with mathematics. One can even say that mathematics is the art of turning anything into numbers in some sense. But then of course within mathematics we have very diverse approaches to how we think of numbers. If you've ever taken a class in set theory and foundations of mathematics, you would see that it really takes some time until you're able to say, for example, prove that 1 + 1 = 2. I mean, it sounds very silly, but it really takes some time to build sort of a formal tower of structures to actually be able to say meaningful things about numbers. And in fact, if you're a fan of logicism and the history of foundations of mathematics in the 19th and early 20th century, you would know that the crucial feature that mathematicians and logicists were demanding of a formal system of axioms was that it contained arithmetic, meaning it had numbers in any meaningful sense. And all Gödel's completeness theorems and incompleteness theorems are tied to this requirement. And so for those of you who are familiar with this, you would then say it's very natural. So anyway, so this is a very big overview, very broad overview of what numbers sort of entail in scientific thinking. And so I'm gonna just move it over to Lucy. So I'll go back to the faces, and yeah, I'm very happy to support the discussion and to participate in any way. But by all means, go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That was very exciting to hear it all summarized very neatly at the beginning. A lot of the points we will be touching on today, but of course, as with the nature of fundamental questions, I think even just one of our representatives today could have about 10 times the amount that we will fit in this one event. And as you said, like, we have the professionals from the last event who are incredibly interested in the things that they have to say and the things that they've learned about the subject. And these kind of questions transcend all ages, professions. This interest and curiosity is present in everybody here, and I'm sure in the audience members as well. So I think how we're going to start off this discussion is to do with numbers being part of the physical world versus being very much constrained to our minds and our cognitive projection onto this physical world. So Luca and Diana, I would love to hear, I'd like you to give us an insight into why there might be a disagreement on how measurement can reveal the true nature of the natural numbers. Luca, if you'd like to start us off, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Measurement's a really weird one. So I'm going to start with a story, if that's all right, about a group of people a very long time ago called the Pythagoreans, followers of Pythagoras, who all know from like a theorem and stuff. But these people were a bit obsessed with this idea about maths, that everything in the world is basically diagnosable and like reducible to rational numbers, or basically ratios between whole numbers. So you'd have, and that's how we describe rational numbers as ratios and proportions between different whole numbers. And they, they use music and they use a variety of art forms to express this. And they were dead certain that the world had some kind of, inherent, non-empirical, sort of independent from human experience, mathematical perfection. And it took, legend has it, this isn't necessarily a true story, but legend has it that Hippasus, who was one of the Pythagoreans, discovered one day that you could have numbers that couldn't be expressed as a ratio of these things, or we would call them irrational numbers, like the square root of 2, for example. These are like recurrent decimals going forever and stuff. And the story goes that Pythagoras saw this and was like, oh no, and then drowned him. So that was the first time that happened. And what this reveals, apart from the lack of this mathematical perfection, that there are a lot of irrational numbers. Not only there are a lot of them, but they're really important. I mean, we see like the golden mean in like architecture and nature, for example. And then you think a little bit further and you realize, actually, hang on, all the numbers are irrational in some sense. I mean, measurement is a strange one because we pinpoint an exact numerical value onto something in the world, but actually it's never perfect like that. Nothing is ever 1 centimeter long, or nothing is ever a particular numerical weight. There's always a tiny little bit in, to be distinguished and stuff. But then, for some reason, we continue to do this. We continue to put things in these terms when they're clearly not perfect. I mean, we're getting rid of a lot of the information about mathematics, and that's what I call modeling. I think that measurement in itself is a form of modeling. We're taking the instance in the physical world of something and attributing it some kind of formal, symbolic nature that we can repeat and use again in other circumstances. It doesn't necessarily exactly reflect the reality, but takes all the important information. And modeling itself is a form of abstraction. It's basically you're in taking a thing and standardizing it to taking a phenomenon and giving it a name and being able to use that name to describe other phenomena that are similar. You're recognizing a pattern, you're identifying something with that. And in one of my favorite books, Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, there's a really important distinction made between these two kinds of abstraction. One of them is where you basically remove all kinds of resemblance from the phenomenon, from the physical phenomenon. You give symbols that are totally unrelated and there's no meaning attached. It's just you're taking away every component of the thing. And then there's another more important, which is the iconographic abstraction, where you take away the physical manifestations of something, but you leave it with some kind of pure essence. And this is what written language is to us. And maths, in a way, is is that, and the numbers themselves, they're not all instances of number are the same, but we use the same numbers to express them because we want to express some kind of meaning. So the world of measurement and natural numbers and representing things in terms of numbers is not faithful necessarily to reality, but it is faithful to our ability to understand the world in terms of repeated phenomena and kind of have a general understanding of how the world works. And this way of approaching the world is our way of kind of genuinely cognitively engaging with the world and identifying things, giving them nature's properties, inherent kind of intrinsic natures. And this kind of helps us to sort of know when we want to kind of program a machine to think how we think. We want to kind of emulate our own thinking. It's really important that it's able to take kind of these general instances of things and create a unifying framework for it. That's the job.
That's really great. Thank you, Luca. Diana, would you like to respond to this topic? That would be great.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in biology, you have examples of both of what you were saying. Like you have, on one side, examples in which you have patterns and repeated patterns and sequences that you can, quantify and understand, like the Fibonacci sequence, of course, I guess the cliche reference when it comes to nature. When it comes to, the patterns of petals, phyllotaxis, measuring the arrangement of petals, arrangements of seeds and branches in plants. So you have Fibonacci sequence, you have the golden ratio, ranging from things like the molecule of DNA, when you have the repeated, how do you say? Well, you have the repeating unit on the DNA molecule. It's like the length up to the width is the golden ratio. It's 34 angstroms to 21. It's the golden ratio. Then you have also the uterus, for example. A study was done with 5,000 women, and over time, over their life, ranging from when they were at birth to old age, the ratio of the length to the width of the uterus changes. And as a measure of fertility, actually, when women are most fertile, it's when the ratio is 1.6, which is really close to 1.618. And that's, I think, really fascinating because at birth it goes from 2, and then all the way to old age it goes to 1.4. So you have examples of patterns and ratios, but then you also have the other side of nature and biology with things which shows how, our, I guess, maybe obsession or interest in quantifying and measuring things kind of is no match for the complexity of nature. You have certain things like bees, for example, when they're trying to communicate with each other within the hive, they want to, communicate where food is. And if food is farther than 50 meters, they will have a particular dance, it's called the waggle dance. And I think that's really cool because you have like this particular pattern in which they rotate their abdomen, and like the angle at which they rotate their abdomen is an indication of the distance of where the food is, the direction. It's so complex and it's really hard to measure and to quantify. And I think in that sense, numbers are no match for that complexity from my understanding. I don't know what you guys think, but you have both sides. Yeah.
Do you still think that we would get a sense of the true nature of numbers from this biological form of measurement then? So this communication between different animals, do you think that reveals the true nature of numbers? Would you say that?
If I understand correctly, I think in biology, like if you measure something, just because you measure it doesn't mean you're, exactly capturing exactly what it means, if that makes sense. Like, the sum is greater, or the system is greater than the sum of its parts, right? Like you can't exactly measure something and reflect its entire complexity, if that's what you're asking. But yeah, that's just what I think. Yeah.
Okay, so that in that sense, biology and philosophy might tend to agree that measurement and modeling, this kind of estimation of this inexact form, is no match for the abstractions that we've made about the natural numbers and how we've formalized it.
Yeah.
Kartikeya, would you like to respond to both of those points?
Yeah, so building up from the obsession of our numbers, which Diana mentioned, I think humans do have an incessant need for numbers because, when, let's say you're making a plan, let's meet up at a restaurant. The first thing you ask is where, when? And to quantify that is to give it coordinates and time and space, which are necessarily numbers itself. In the world of physics, numbers are so fundamental that they give birth to literally all the theories there are. every theory that we currently have today started with someone collecting data in the form of numbers, and then maybe interpreting the data in different forms, let's say plotting a graph, and then leading up to something big as the theory of gravity, or let's say the theory of planetary motion. But also, so Luca mentioned how it's abstract to actually think of abstract to actually measure stuff, and how we stop at a certain point. Let's say if we say 1 meter, and we don't really follow up 1 point x, y, z. But in physics, we do actually account for that fact by, let's say, factoring in the uncertainties. The first thing we're taught in experimental physics is that measurements mean nothing without the uncertainty. And our results are practically baseless, because we could say have an answer, but without accounting for the uncertainty in that answer, we are practically up to nothing. Because when we do actually factor in that answer to yield something practical, when we don't know what's the extent of the precision, we are practically as good as not having an answer at all. And our incessant need of numbers has grown so much that moving up to quantum physics, we say when we measure something, we are actually disturbing the system. So even measurement in itself is not really something we should be doing. Saying that the example of the classic Schrodinger's cat, that we don't know whether the cat is alive or dead unless we measure it, and we have to disturb the system to actually measure it. So that actually talks about how numbers are not fundamental in the truest sense of the nature, and it's something humans have probably developed for their own ease, and to maybe quantify what we actually see. And we're so obsessed with numbers that we're trying to actually quantify randomness itself. And that's something as a concept is quite fascinating to me. That when we heard about randomness, when we heard about entropy, the first thought that came to our mind is, you know what, let's put a value to this thing. Let's give this a value of delta S, and maybe even quantify randomness itself. And that is something that speaks about our incessant need to quantify basically everything we see.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So what you're suggesting is that not only is measurement not able to inform us on the true nature of numbers, but measurement might even disturb and interrupt and get in the way of our understanding of the true nature of what numbers might be. But and even further than that, that numbers are just something we apply to physical phenomena to help us understand and communicate it, as opposed to revealing anything about the true nature of the systems that we're explaining. Fanula, I'd love to hear your response to this.
Yeah, so I think all these points have been really interesting, but I think the idea of oneness in like real life, so from just like being a child, as Carlos mentioned earlier, you're taught like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on your fingers. Those are physical things that you can see, and it's not like as Luca measured, where you don't know if it's exactly 1 or not. Like you see a finger and that is 1 in your head as a child, or you I don't know, you see cars going past your bedroom, it's like 1, 2, 3. Those are like physical things that we're taught as a child, as the idea of counting. And so I think this idea of oneness is really interesting, but also how things can be 1 in their own, but can also be a fraction when related to other things. So for example, like a human, I see you and I see 1 person, but when your mum and your sisters come in the room, I could call you 1 family. And so I think this kind of idea of numbers is all to do with relative, like with the relative nature to what you're surrounded by, and the kind of idea that your brain's trying to recognize and use within like the bigger picture. So for example, I'm like a musician as well as studying maths. So with music notes, you have like 1 crotchet, but when you put them together, that can make, depending on how many you have minims, whatever. But that's fine as a way of your brain kind of working out how they are relative to the other notes that are surrounding them in music. But depending on the tempo that your music's going from one crotchet could last for a second in one piece and 10 seconds in another one. So I think this idea of numbers as a way of measuring like relativity to what is surrounding it is really interesting. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be an accurate measure of 1 meter, for example, but it's to do with 1 meter in comparison to the 2 meters that stood next to it.
That's really interesting. So you're saying that the physical approximations that we, or the identities that we assign to things that we count or measure, gives us an idea of change or comparison or context, which is important for communication, as mathematics is essentially just a language in which to differentiate one thing from another, or identify one thing as similar to another. That's actually really interesting. I'm studying maths as well in my second year, and it begs the question of this idea of relation between when you count. Effectively, what you're doing is defining a monotonic relation between a subset of the natural numbers to physical things that you're seeing, coins, cars, sheep, whatever. But also how this develops from your idea of when you're a child, numbers and numeracy is very much physical and spatial or temporal. Roxana, would you like to give us an insight into how that develops as you grow up, or the
I actually wanted to relate to the Cartec's earlier point on how humans want to kind of obsessively quantify and measure things that may not necessarily be quantifiable or measurable. While doing some research, I thought that counting compulsive OCD seemed to be so common among OCD patients. But in reality, numbers just happen to be such an easy way to habitualize tasks and latch onto habits. So it is that obsession with wanting to do something a certain number of times, but that's not necessarily because there's anything specific about special about those numbers, but because our mind wants to be in a certain pattern. So for example, people may want to count to 12 numbers of times, or place decorations in their house exactly 10 centimeters away from the edge or something like that. And coupled with that OCD, especially magical thinking OCD, that can tell them, oh, something bad will happen unless you do this. That can really mess up someone's life. How an obsession with numbers that seemingly is not disruptive at all, that obsession about something completely arbitrary can be so destructive.
So you're saying our application and use of numbers to describe the world around us can be in some ways damaging, or can lead to this idea that we have to have these patterns and these repetitions. We have to look for this sense of quantifying things, or enumerating the world around us to the point where it's actually detrimental to our psychology, to our mental psyche.
Yeah, I think most of the time it's useful in engineering and physics and practical applications, but when coupled with a mental disorder such as OCD, that can really trigger and spiral into something that can't be controlled.
Do you think that it ties into the question as to how important numbers are for how our brain works, and how we the strength of the link, and therefore the importance of, or the fundamentality of numbers, just as a base system for what we place sciences on, what we build sciences from?
Yeah, it seems so. It seems like people take the arbitrariness of numbers. So a lot of people have a favorite number or an unlucky number, and take that to have meaning even though it has none. So that really is that what Cartier was talking about.
Lovely. And leading on from that, Cartier, would you like to respond to that?
So I wanted to basically say what I meant was, I didn't necessarily mean that it was really detrimental to our mental health or psyche about obsessing with numbers. I think it's the other way around. when we quantify something, it's kind of saying that we understand it, and it brings us a sense of hope, a sense of feeling connected to the world, that I see it and I understand it. So I don't think it's basically detrimental to your understanding, even though it's something arbitrary, even though numbers are something arbitrary. I don't think 90% of the people that are alive today will go to depths like understanding what numbers truly are, and to them, what they see is actually what it is. And maybe to some people like us who go into STEM subjects, or maybe theorize about philosophy and say, oh yeah, numbers aren't actually real, they're just arbitrary. Maybe to us, it's kind of it's a realization for us, but to the rest 90% of the world, they are what they see, and I don't think, and it just gives them a sense of hope. So I think it's actually a good thing that they can understand, they can feel a sense of hope by quantifying things. But after that, you mentioned astrology, or maybe like having a lucky number, which I think is kind of detrimental to your mental health. So yeah, I do agree with that point completely.
And to get back a bit on topic, Sharissa, would you like to respond to some of the earlier points as well?
Yes, thanks, Lucy. I think what's been really great hearing is like this randomness of like how numbers are supposed to kind of formalize randomness, and it's supposed to give us this level of certainty. But I think, Lucy, in our previous discussions, we basically spoke about how, I think coming from a mathematical point of view, we use numbers to describe everyday situations. So, personally, I don't think maths necessarily categorizes patterns. I mean, yeah, to a certain point, I think maths is kind of full of theories and kind of tried and tested ways in which we formalize these patterns, and we say, hey, 2 + 2 is 4. That's how we add. But I think going on a higher level here, I say maths can impact the world. And I mean, call me hopeful and optimistic, but I think one prime example of this, upon doing some research, was the kind of invention of negative numbers, which I thought was quite fascinating. So when they kind of came up with negative numbers back then, it was looked down upon for people to lend money, right? And negative numbers allowed that to happen. So hence people hated negative numbers because it allowed this kind of sinful act to take place. But now you kind of fast forward to modern day times, and we love lending money. We love the concept of interest. And I think maths transcends patterns. And I think it does this because it is a study of patterns. It's quite weird. But yeah, so I think upon thinking about this more, and upon, I think Luca mentioned this, like the patterns, and then we had kind of a person mentioning the randomness of it all. I think, it's only as random as we think it is, weirdly enough, because I mean, we only know what we think we know. But to kind of finish off, I do feel like, numbers inform like the everyday situations we find ourselves in, but also these everyday situations are formalized and described through numbers. And that link is what we're quite conscious of, not the link that numbers actually inform how we function every day. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think what has started off as a kind of formalization process has now developed in advance to something more artificial that can be applied to these systems that are more random, but also maths is very good at describing the irregular and compressible, and numbers are an example of that. Numbers, we discretize the continuous kind of landscape of ideas in the world around us. Luca, you had a question for Sharissa. Would you like to ask that?
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the point that she made about that maths is not patterns itself, but it's a study of patterns. Therefore, it transcends patterns in a way. So it's like kind of a meta theory of patterns. Like because it's about patterns, it can't then be made of patterns. It has to. It sounds a bit weird, but like it has to kind of be something above. And then I'm just curious about what kind of demands that we're placing upon maths. If we say that, hang on, it's got to be beyond our experience of it. It's got to have some kind of reality beyond that, and I wonder what people are thinking about some kind of like, you know, do we have to then rely upon rules and assumptions? Do we have to kind of create an initial framework for maths if we're not going to consider it as just in its physical incarnation? We're going to have to kind of come up with some other way of, you know, defining it.
So what was your question for Sharissa? Very, very nicely summarized this idea that when we think about a number that's not about the patterns itself, and kind of linking to Kartike's point of this point of reference, these axioms or this coordinate system, you have to find the zero, you have to find where you're defining the start point. Yeah, could you maybe elaborate for Sharissa a bit more?
Yeah. Sorry, it was a weird question format. I sort of like if maths is the study of the patterns, then there must be something kind of if the patterns are all kind of together in a sense, they're all, you know, they must have some common property, and what are those properties? Is my question basically.
That's really interesting. I think, you know, like Lucy and I were talking before this call, you know, on our one-on-one meetings, and she raised a really great point that I've never really thought about. The fact that, you know, as you said, Luca, maths is patterns, and it's like a compilation of patterns, but what is the end goal? And if so, how do we achieve that as mathematicians? I think that's what you're getting at. So Lucy kind of said to me, it's amazing, it boggles her mind that we as mathematicians can like get to a level where we potentially know everything about maths. And she says that then that's when it's a blank canvas. And it's like the world is our oyster. And we can potentially create new theories and create new patterns, but then to influence the world such that it feeds into the bigger kind of mathematical picture. But just briefly, I think that's amazing. But then you ask, like, how would we know what other theories and what other additions to make to maths once we know the patterns? And this is where disciplinarity comes in, right? That's when I look to biology. That's when I look to AI. That's when I look to physics. That's when I look to engineering. And I think that's why this conversation is so important, because I think when we look at each other and we look at our disciplines, we grow each other. So yeah.
Perfect. That's really great. Thank you, Sharissa. Daniel, would you like to respond to the points that have come so far?
Yeah, right. So Sharissa, as you said, coming up with these mathematical things like arithmetic and making these new theories in maths to describe things. And Luca, you said something about studying like the study of patterns, like the meta theory of patterns, and like what we want to do so we can kind of imagine if all of humanity went extinct and humans somehow were reborn, right, from day one of primal ages, we would not be able to know whether our conceptualization of numbers would be the same as the one that we have right now, right? And in a way, this is kind of what we want to get out of artificial intelligence, where we have all of these, we can give it a bunch of data, and it can recognize all sorts of patterns, and we have these algorithms that can generate mathematical theories. Or like, in a way, you can't say that you make them, but you discover them in a way. Maybe this new human civilization would discover pi, but it would be maybe in a different way than the way that we discovered it. And so maths, I see it as mostly it's how we have made sense of phenomena that we see in patterns, right? And then we now use artificial intelligence, and we can study the brain and simulate how is it possible for the brain to recognize these patterns, which in a way is like that's what we're trying to get at, but the computing power is not really there yet. But we can use these unsupervised deep neural learning networks to really recognize relations between numbers that humans are not able to discover or haven't been able to discover yet. and really study patterns in a way, in a much new modern way, in a sense.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what's really interesting that you've brought up is how computers and this AI, deep learning, machine learning, computer science, they rely on this binary input numbers, the conceptualization of numbers themselves that we've come up with, these ones and zeros, to form these such complex systems that can now recognize these patterns. And as Shirsa and Luca said, mathematics is a language to describe patterns. It transcends patterns in that way. So you could say that computers and AI and deep learning, machine learning is the kind of highest form or most complex version of mathematics that we have to date that really can find patterns or generate, store information. It's kind of what we've used numbers for in the past. And currently it's the most advanced way to do that, to increase the complexity of what we're looking at. So numbers themselves are very ordered, structured, like a system and a concept. Like from the Kano axioms, you have very characteristic ordering. You have a number defined and then the next number defined in its relation to that number, either above or below. And yet what's come from this, even if our human brains don't have the capacity to process patterns at such high levels of complexity with more randomness and idiosyncrasies, more variables, these computers are a way to do that in the future. And simulate like neural networks, as you said, feeding it more abstract ways that we as humans interpret numbers. So like you said, from like visual stimuli or audio stimuli, that kind of thing, having a machine that can think the way that we do, but also go down new avenues of abstraction or thought about the numbers that we've programmed it with and to understand. Okay, so next, Diana, would you like to respond to the points that have come?
Yeah, something I just realized is like numerosity and maths and coming up with theories and trying to understand everything, this language we've created, I think it's our inherent way to kind of deal with the chaos. So it's our way to, I think, Roxana, you were saying, our needing to, be calm and have an understanding and organization of what's going on and all this information that is presented to us. I know it's very general, but what I'm trying to say is like, just in biology, when it comes to just life, it's about optimization and maximizing resources and trying to, be as efficient as possible, whether it's digestion, whether it's like DNA synthesis, whether it's anything, evolution. So this recurrence of patterns, I think this recurrence of patterns, as I was saying before with the golden ratio, all these things that we see, this consistency, it's our way of becoming efficient, our way, by our, I mean biology's way to make life as efficient as possible. And I think that's really cool because, yeah, just something I realized right now. Our obsession with numbers is important, and it also shows through evolution how it's important to have patterns, it's important to have organization from a survival perspective. Yeah.
That's amazing. So you think this idea of change in patterns and comparison is more fundamental than the conceptualization of numbers themselves, or but also that our survival and the survival of perhaps other species as well, like plants or animals, I'd love to hear your perspective on that, is very fundamental for their survival. So not only have we been able to advance our idea of number and counting or quantizing things, but other species have been able to harness that too at a maybe more fundamental level. Do you think that this might reveal more about the way that we process numbers to start off with, if we look for it in other living creatures or other living beings?
I think, yeah, we've successfully, in some aspects, of course, managed to quantify this optimization, like, for example, with Venus flytraps. I think, so when they close, they have to have a certain amount of stimuli. I think it's 3 when they're stimulated 3 times on the little hairs on their leaves. if there's a certain amount and if it reaches that threshold, then they will close, right? If they were to close every time, they'd be wasting so much energy. They would be wasting, chemistry. They'd be wasting all the biochemical processes happening. It would be to waste because they'd be closing and there would be no food. So they would, lose energy. So that's one example. And then just even when it comes to action potentials and like electrochemical signals within the brain and within the body, you have a certain voltage threshold that you have to surpass for a certain process to occur. And I think, well, I'm not an expert with neuroscience, but or this area, but I think, yeah, it all comes down to maximizing the resources so you don't waste energy, so you can continue living, so you can reproduce and grow as a species. Yeah.
Lovely. That's really interesting. Thank you for that. I think next I would like to have Fanula's response to what's come so far.
So yeah, this is just carrying on a bit from the biology nature of it. And I think, especially at the moment, living in this global pandemic, the idea of numbers and that being important and understanding the transmission of the disease and kind of how we can use numbers that we've got in the present day to predict the future. So using statistics and data and how, like again, with computers, getting all this data, having so many external factors influencing it, how we can use that to predict like how the virus is going to spread as this example. So I think it's really interesting how even without the facts, like we're kind of transcending the patterns that are going on in life and using all this knowledge of and these numbers that we've collected from past experiences to be able to project that further into time that we have absolutely no idea about. And so it wasn't really posing a question, but I just thought it'd be interesting to see what others kind of had to say about this idea of using numbers to move forward into the future.
Lovely, that's really interesting. So I know in philosophy there's this idea that some philosophers have an idea that you can't say, okay, this has happened every time so far, so if I do this thing one more time, it will happen again. Like dropping a pen on a table, it will make a sound, it will hit the table. Doing it 50 times, there's nothing to say that the 51st time it will actually happen. But also, Kartik, I think that leads quite nicely onto this idea of the difference between like theoretical physics and versus like the practical side of it and more numerically informed side. Yeah, if you'd like to contribute after.
So firstly, I would like to start with the point of patterns, which was something Luca asked. So I think the point of patterns is prediction itself. We observe patterns and try to maybe form an idea of what is going to happen next, which is very essential to our survival as well, which I think Diana mentioned. And following up from what you asked, Lucy, I think that is what I was trying to say. When we follow up from patterns, the 51st time you drop that pen, it's not certain that it is going to make the same sound. But if we observe the first 50 carefully, we can predict the probability of how strong of a sound it will produce. And even though our predictions are never certain, they do help us in a lot of ways. Let's say if we talk about biology, if a deer sees a tiger and 9 out of 10 times the tiger attacks it, the next time it's going to predict that the tiger is going to attack it and maybe help that in its survival. It's not necessarily sure that the tiger will attack the deer as soon as it sees it, but still in the minds of the deer, it has to predict what will usually happen in a situation like that and has to maybe move on. So it has to recognize a pattern, which is maybe established due to n number of ways. A pattern could be established through maybe like numbers, because there could be a pattern could be established from, let's say, an arithmetic progression, a geometric progression, but basically a number of ways. But what's important is how we recognize patterns, which is kind of also the point of the maths, maths as a subject, to maybe recognize the patterns of numbers and maybe follow up what's going to happen next and predict, which is very useful in basically every subject, physics, philosophy, cognitive science, to just basically recognize patterns and maybe follow up and predict what's going to happen next. And yeah. Also, I would like to follow up. I think someone mentioned someone said the sentence, "It's only random as you think it is," which is something I disagree with. I think it was Sharissa. I think I disagree with this point because randomness in itself is quite a fundamental thing. You know, it's like you can't really say the universe will not expand in a random manner if you're not looking at it or if you don't know it is. It's going to happen whether or not you know it. It's not good. It's not all in your head. It is something that's there. It's something we can measure. It's something we can predict. So I don't think it's something that's all in our head. It's something we look at patterns. We predict that the universe is gonna maybe expand. So say like that, and that is what I mean when I say randomness is something fundamental and not something arbitrary.
Following on from this idea of prediction, I think in biology you have this example, which is necessary for survival and mating, reproduction. In frogs, they have a phrase of calls, certain sounds that they make, and other frogs nearby effectively have an accumulator, this thing that fires every time they hear a sound, and then a process in their brains that will be able to replicate that, but in a way to add another sound onto that phrase, because it demonstrates a better physical strength if you can make more sounds within a phrase to attract a mate. And this idea that they can have this neuron that fires. This is the theory anyway, or what their best guess so far. Every time they hear these sounds, the neuron fires and it triggers a certain other neuron that preferentially responds to the idea of like fiveness or sixness or threeness. That these are separate in the brain or connected, and then it would be able to not only recognize the pattern, remember it, store it, repeat it, and add one, and they would from experience and predict that that this pattern would keep on going until a physical limit rather than a cognitive one in terms of counting. I think that's what Luke was saying at the beginning as well Daniel was saying with physical limits for how different cognitive systems compute numbers. So for example, like computers, we're moving more to quantum computers because they have much fewer limitations than our own brains and the brains of other species and different things like that. Sharissa, if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to Kartikeya because I agree with you. I feel like as humans, we don't control the randomness in a sense where it's outside ourselves. And I think as we've been speaking about like maths, we use maths to formalize these patterns that we perceive the randomness to be. So I think that's what I was getting at. I was getting at the fact that we only think it is as random as we perceive it. So it is random, but I think it's only as random as we know it to be. And I think Luca may agree with me here that we don't know anything. And so and what we're speaking about here today is what we perceive. And that was my point, that we only perceive something as random as we think it is. And that's in essence what maths is, what we perceive. And in a way, maths is limited in terms of what we learn at school. But I must say, I've really felt it's been rewarding coming to university and really having my mind opened as to what maths can do. And I mean, the interdisciplinarity talk that we're doing today has just done more so. Yeah,
for sure. I think interdisciplinary is very interesting because we, as different subjects and disciplines, we have different languages or different kind of dialects of the same language that we use to talk about, for different uses in different disciplines. So like you said, randomness in physics might be defined differently from the philosophical perception of randomness, and the idea that maybe randomness is just a signal of a sign of things that we don't yet understand and we can't yet formalize into compressible kind of mathematical equations. In physics, you have equations that with variables that are placeholders for numbers, and like the equations themselves that describe the relations. So there's the question of what's actually more important, the fundamental concept of numbers themselves or the processes and operations and the possibility for numbers, or that, for example, in theoretical physics or more theoretical studies and abstractions. Diana, would you like to just follow on from a previous point that we had about biology, if you had missed something there?
Yeah, but also as previously mentioned, I think just the awareness of, well, our awareness of our own knowledge with respect to numerosity, I think that's in biology, like, it's not that they're aware of the numbers, or it's not that they're aware of, like the Venus flytrap, for example. I don't think they're aware that they have to wait 3 times. I think it's just inherent processes that we don't really understand fully how they were, established. It was probably through evolution, and depending on your spiritual background or, belief systems, whether it was natural selection that favored this, whether it was, this, I guess, gets into a different realm of, this is, unrelated. But I just think that the awareness of numerosity isn't the same in biology. Like, it's not that they know how many times they have to wait, or they know the frequency, like with the frogs, for example, they don't know they have to wait for that. I think it's just behaviors that are ingrained, or that are, accumulated over evolutionary time within our DNA of the given species. Yeah.
I think that's a really lovely summary to that point. Roxana, would you like to give us a link between this and maybe go more into counting aspect of numbers?
Yeah, I think like animals, humans are born with some kind of innate number sense, because, well, John Piaget, who studied children development, thought that babies only start to develop object permanence in their first 2 years of life. And he did experiments showing that, for example, peekaboo, the children may think that the parent disappears or hiding an object under a blanket. The child doesn't start looking for it, but they just start crying, thinking that it's gone. Later on in life, but still younger than 2 years old, a child may look under the blanket, find the thing. Then if you hide the thing under another blanket, they would look where they last found it rather than where they saw you hide it. But coincidentally, experiments of a puppet show showing, for example, I have pens here, pens being hidden behind a screen. If the screen went down and still revealed the same amount of numbers that had been hidden, the babies were less surprised than if the number of pens had been changed. And they knew that by tracking their eyes and seeing how long they looked at the object. So if they looked longer, it means that they are more surprised to see the result. Also, it seemed that babies had some kind of ability to add, maybe not precisely, but if one object was hidden, then another object was added behind the screen, they would be more surprised to see one object again rather than the 2 objects. So it does seem like babies from a very, very early age do have some kind of number sense, and they can already differentiate between numbers, especially if their ratios are high. For example, like, it's easier for them to differentiate between 8 and 4 objects than 8 and 6. Later on in life, when children start counting, they may learn the pattern of 1, 2, 3, but then they still may not understand numerosity. So a child that knows how to count can go 1, 2, 3, but then when you ask them, so how many pens are there? They would say, I don't know, because they haven't learned yet the concept of numbers properly. A stage later, they may then start to understand 1, 2, 3, and then they would know, oh, the last number uttered is the number of things in a collection. But still, even then, when asked, oh, here's a ball of things, can you give me 3 things? They would still grab a handful, or may not yet connect the numerosity and the concept of the threeness of a set. Yeah, that's really all I was going to say about children and learning to count.
That's perfect. That's really, really insightful. I find that fascinating. Alba, would you like to follow on a bit more about cognitive science? I think this is a really good opportunity for that.
Yeah, so developmental psychologists actually found that finger counting may precede verbal counting during development. And I think this links nicely to a point that Fionola mentioned earlier about counting on our fingers. So this idea of embodied numerosity, that numbers are not just mental representations, but they're very much grounded in our bodies as well. So how we process numbers will differ depending on how we count on our fingers in different cultures. So for example, most Western cultures will start counting on their left hand, and the Middle Eastern cultures will start counting on their right hand. So that changes how you perceive the world around you and how you start counting things and how you represent numbers in space. And the other thing is that, for example, there's this one study that compared German participants, both hearing and deaf German participants, to, for example, Chinese participants who have it's not an explicit counting system. So for example, Germans will count like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But then, so they'll use both hands. But then Chinese speakers, they will count differently. So for example, 6 is like this. So they won't count 6 as like this. And this influences how you compare different quantities, the magnitude of numbers. So if, for example, we present German speakers with 2 pairs of numbers, like 3 and 4, so you can represent them on one hand. This is easier to compare which number is bigger than if you present them with a pair of numbers that you can represent on 2 hands, even if the difference between the 2 numbers is not that big or it's the same. It's still very much embodied in our bodies. So yeah, it's just that the idea of numbers not being merely a mental representations, but also an embodied experience. Yeah,
that's really interesting. Yeah, so our ability to process the physical world around us affects how we then perceive numbers as well. That's really interesting, and that's also based on culture and language very much as the fact that the mind and the body are part of one complex system and not 2 separate things, such as was once thought. Yeah, Roxana, would you like to respond to that or elaborate?
Yeah, just with the embodiment, how numerosity is embodied, it's also very much embedded and heavily relies on perception in the early stages of learning when we don't yet have the symbolic understanding. Our numerosity heavily relies on the environment. So for example, there are studies where children were shown 2 rows of coins, 5 coins in each row. When they were placed equally spaced apart, the children could say, oh yes, there are the same amount of coins in both rows. Then when the coins in one row were spread out further, the children would reliably say that there are more coins in that row, even though clearly nothing had been changed about the set other than their positioning. So this was evidence for Piaget to think that children only rely on their perception and how something looks rather than how something is. But surprisingly, other experiments where the question was posed differently. So not which set has more, because children could maybe just understand looks bigger is more. The children are asked, it was actually groups of sweets this time. There's 4 sweets in one row, 6 sweets in another, and the 6 sweets were pushed together, the 4 sweets were spread apart. The children were asked, which sweets would you like to eat? The children reliably said that they would rather have the row with 6 sweets over the 4, even when the 4 sweets looked bigger. So that kind of contradicted Piaget's earlier theory. But yeah, numerosity is still very heavily embedded in perception. And that was also shown in another experiment where children had to share cookies between dolls. So if you placed them in front of the dolls, they could easily make stacks, compare the heights of the stack, or make lines on the floor, compare the lengths of the lines of cookies to decide if they had been shared equally. But when the experiment was changed and they had to put coins in a piggy bank, they could no longer see the coins and compare afterwards. So that really made them unable to complete the task as easily as when they had the visual perception available to them.
That's really interesting. So it shows as we develop these, the reason we develop this conceptual understanding of numbers is to deal with things that we don't necessarily have physical resources for. So like counting on the fingers once we get to larger numbers, or when we stop having physical things to refer to, like in really advanced, like the edges of different sciences. And in current research. It's essential to be able to think about things that you can't see, that you can't hear, that you can't perceive in the physical sense or the time sense. So, Luca, would you like to respond to the points that have been made?
Yeah, I'm really interested in this question about counting numbers and basic arithmetic and how kind of embedded it is, how fundamental it is, how kind of it's so kind of it's the most initial part, the first and only kind of basic structure of our process of learning maths. It's like, and counting in itself comes from identification. We're talking about pattern recognition. Pattern recognition gives you, if you see a pattern over and over again, you're going to assume some kind of continued identity of this thing that you're looking at. And that's what identification is, ascribing some kind of identity. And counting, saying that's one thing, that's another thing, and that's another thing. That comes from a repeated process of identification of different things. I mean, the only obstacle to that would be if you start to blur the lines between two different things, and this is actually the same thing. And that happens a lot. Biological discoveries have made that in terms of genomes and stuff, and a lot of things have come through it. And in philosophy, this is a kind of a famous sort of idealistic thing of you're not experiencing one thing, you're just experiencing a constant state of change. And there's that really annoying car bumper sticker by Heraclitus, which is, you can never step in the same river twice, and that kind of stuff. But this illuminates quite an important thing, which is between each thing you have a non-enumerable, a non-countable infinity of states of change between things, and things are always constantly infinite states of change. And it's really important for counting to happen, for us to be able to assume some kind of continued identity in something. That's the kind of the most basic assumption. It might not be grounded in reason, but it's grounded definitely in a will to kind of engage cognitively with the world and understand things. And modeling, as I was saying before, is kind of in this spirit. It's saying, well, hang on, here's a big mess of stuff. We're going to take away most of that stuff and keep these things because we think they all fall under the same group. They all have this common property, and as a result, they're all going to be considered as one thing. And that's like, in terms of from a kind of cognitive perspective, that level of interpretation is really, really, really basic. Rather than I guess you don't have to be so faithful to the idea of representation of an exact kind of physical reality. You can say, well, hang on, just in terms of what learning is and in terms of what understanding is, this is a really, really important part of that process. And, forget what's in the real world. In my mind, this is a really important part of how I engage properly with the world.
Thank you very much. Daniel, would you like to respond to this?
Yeah, Luca, and I remember you talked about also how we program computers to make these things comprehensible to us. And like on this fundamental level of like how a computer works, we need a discrete system in order to even make things understandable to us, right? So if you want a computer to count time, like how do we even define time if our physical world is continuous and there are infinite points between two parts in time, right? We've taken these materials where we count how many times something happens, and then after a certain given amount of time, and after a certain amount of times we've counted this, a certain amount of time has passed. We know that. So we are dependent on these universally constant numbers to even make time perceivable, right? And if we look at definition of all the SI units in physics, say, we use universal constants that we can kind of make sense of in our minds. With maybe like time is based on radioactive decay. In computers, we use electrical oscillations, right? And like when we program computers, what we want to do is we can't like say if we want to make a graph of a continuous function, that's not really possible with the limited amount of pixels we have on a screen, right? So we need at some point to, as you said, rip apart strip it from a bunch of complexity to make it understandable to like the human mind, and split it up into separate countable things, like kind of make the system discrete from a continuous system. And I think we kind of need that to even conceptualize numbers or like understand numbers, talk about them, because infinity is not something I think we can comprehend really. That's
a fabulous point to end on. yeah, some. I know everybody wants to say more, but I think we only have time for one more point. Roxana, would you like to have the last say?
Yeah, I was just gonna yes and look at how we need numbers and precise measurement to not only quantify what's out of our perception, but also when our perception may not be reliable. For example, when children, again going back to children, but that's what I research, where children are shown 2 glasses of water or some colored liquid, even though there was the same amount of water in the glass, they would say when water from one glass was poured into a taller, thinner glass, they would say there's more liquid in that glass because it's taller, obviously relying on the perception only rather than their knowledge that the characteristics of an object don't change when poured from one container into another. So yeah, that just really highlighted how we need the precise measurement to prove, even though it looks bigger, it is still the same. We can measure it in quantifiable, specific measurements.
That's really lovely. Unfortunately, I think we don't have time for any more on this event, though I'm sure we'll all stay behind and continue this discussion. Just to summarize, just as has been mentioned so many times during this discussion, our attempts to number is just one of the examples of our attempts to discretize and package, compress this continuous landscape of ideas. And that's all disciplines really are in terms of what we're studying. They're vague categories to aid communication. We're not bounded by these areas of thought. The marriage between them, in fact, breeds real insight and creativity, which I think everyone can all agree has definitely been achieved today. What's most beautiful is when you get to the point in a conversation or a discussion where you are realizing things as you're saying them. It's not rehearsed. It's not you haven't said it before, you haven't even thought it before, and that's really, really beautiful. And that's what we really aim to provide a platform to be able to do. And as the first of many events like this, I think this has been really successful. And thank you so much all for contributing. It couldn't have been what it was without you. I think the collective brain has been thoroughly worked here. And anyone who's watching this in the live stream, I'm sure you want to get involved. I would certainly. So if you just want to, you're very welcome to email myself and any questions or suggestions for future discussions, and any feedback you might have would be greatly appreciated. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. I hope we can all now appreciate the interconnectedness of whatever we're studying, and that really you're not alone in what you're specializing in, and all the subjects are just kind of microcosm for this interdisciplinarity, this wider network of things. Thank you all very much. Carlos, would you like to say a final few words?
Yes, thanks very much. Well, that was a very, very interesting discussion. I think, seeing, as I said at the beginning, young, bright minds bringing this angle to the topic, I think is really interesting. I was just sitting here with all the big shots and the famous scientists last week, and now seeing people from my university and this younger generations is very inspiring. So I'm very moved by your motivation, and particularly Lucy. Lucy has been incredible organizing this event. I think she's worked really hard, so she deserves a round of virtual applause. So yes, of course. Thanks very much, Lucy. And yes, I think that what we did today here, I think should be a template for what can be. And yes, it was confined in time, and these kind of conversations, I think, are very tricky to confine in time. So that's another very positive point to Lucy's accomplishment today. But yes, so we will be hopefully having regular such events. Who knows if in person and being able to actually mingle and discuss at length. And for everyone watching, anyone interested, follow us on social media. SEMF is going to be having many more events like the ones that you're seeing. And well, for those of you here in the Zoom call, I just want to thank you personally. I think that what you managed to do today is something that I've always envisioned in the many universities I've been when I was an undergrad and doing my PhD in Edinburgh. I joined some of the societies, and seeing societies actually come together and cooperate I think is really important. So if the Edinburgh SEMF chapter aspires to be anything, is to be that unifying force and that sort of communal effort to bring in different points of view and sort of go after interesting questions like numbers, but obviously like many other topics that I'm sure we'll cover in the future. So I look forward to seeing you in future events, and I wish you the best of your summer ahead, which is also a good time to sort of go over other things. And yes, so thank you all very much for being here, and I'll see you hopefully in some future event.
That's good. And thank you for everyone who watched this and is going to watch this in the recording. The recording will be put up on the YouTube channel, the SEMF YouTube channel, so please check it out if you wanted to go over any points or if you've missed part of it. That's going to be all there. And yeah, keep an eye out for future events, and we'd love to see you in person at some point when things can open up. Yeah, thank you.
Society for Multidisciplinary and Fundamental Research, SEMF from its original Spanish acronym, is created in response to the current scientific, social, and technological environment. Despite the fast communications and interconnectivity of the information age, most branches of knowledge are still largely segregated, and institutions dedicated to their advancement tend to be managerially complex, often constrained by their history and rarely in substantial cooperation with each other. This contrasts with recent developments, showing that today's frontiers of human understanding often lie outside the bounds of traditional disciplines. SEMF aims to address fundamental questions with rigour and honesty, always striving to consider them broadly, profoundly, and contextually. We believe that this type of intellectual endeavour is most likely to flourish in dynamic environments that foster the creative exploration of ideas and the organic growth of research projects and collaborations. SEMF aspires to provide such an environment by keeping things simple, staying managerially lightweight, and being run by a team of active researchers and intellectuals. At SEMF, we promote rationality and scientific thinking across all human inquiry, since we consider these to be the best tools for development of civilization and the understanding of the universe we all inhabit. Our universalist approach to human knowledge helps us bridge the gap between traditionally disjointed disciplines, particularly the familiar yet limiting divide between the sciences and humanities. This mindset allows us to identify deep themes across diverse topics, a powerful asset when trying to unify separate areas of research. Ultimately, SEMF aims to establish a pluralistic community of scientists, creatives, academics, artists, students, intellectuals, and generally enthusiasts united under the common goal of delving deeper into fundamental questions. In principle, all topics are welcome under the SEMF dome. However, given its fundamental nature, subjects such as linguistics, physics, cognitive science, mathematics, complexity science, philosophy, biology, or computer science are well represented in our events and activities. To accomplish our goals, we currently do 3 things. We ideate and organise transdisciplinary conferences and seminars. We host the SEMFoloquia podcast, where small groups of experts with different backgrounds come together to discuss a transversal topic. And we maintain the Agora, a platform implemented on Discord and Telegram, where our members can self-organise and participate in talks, debates, study groups and social gatherings. All the information about SEMF can be found on our website, www.semf.org.es. There you can also become a member in a couple of clicks. In our YouTube channel, you can find our live streams and podcast recordings. And follow us on Twitter to stay up to date with all our events and announcements, and find us on most other social media platforms.